and that patient gets ivermectin. But if the patient is unvaccinated in the hospital, those are the patients who are being denied the ivermectin. And that's how they're getting a difference in results.
Ready to go? Sure. That sounds pretty discriminatory to me. I think something's wrong with that. Well, we are quite blessed to have Dr. Jane Orient as our executive director, and she's been the executive director since 1989. And really, she's her background's in mathematics and chemistry, and she's written some both fiction and nonfiction. Sutton's Law is one piece of fiction that she's written. And she's also done the 2nd through the 5th editions of Sapira's Art and Science of Bedside Diagnosis. She is the editor of AAPS News, so she puts that out every single month. She's also the managing editor of our journal, the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons, and we absolutely could not do it without her. And today she's going to be talking to us about medical diagnosis, bridging art and science. Please welcome our Executive Director, Dr. Jane Orient. Where do you want this, off to the side?
Thank you, Larry. I wish very much that I were writing a fiction piece right now and that it would be modeled on this, but I'm afraid I'm not. I'm afraid this is all too real. We've heard some excellent presentations this morning, and I will try to respond to some of them to the best of my ability. Let me just say it is so wonderful to see all of you again. It has been far too long. This is my book. It's been my project since the late 1980s. It is now in its 5th edition. I don't know whether there will ever be another one because I think both the art and science of medical diagnosis are being destroyed before our very eyes. I call it my book, but it really has many, many authors. I've been to every AAPS annual meeting, and not only have I learned from you all about how to practice medicine in a proper and ethical way, but I have learned so much because this is a group of outstanding clinicians and in all kinds of specialties. And most of the people who have helped me with this book have been members of AAPS, not all of them, but I think all of them up here are members. Some of them regrettably are no longer with us, such as Bud Goltry, Tim Boyles, and Curtis Kane. But some of these people have made tremendous contributions to the book in the way of clinical pearls, finding some mistakes, contributing illustrations and photographs. And so I'm very grateful to each and every one of them. It would not be the same book without contributions for so many physicians. The art of medicine. I think it's impossible to learn this. As it says here, no book can teach it. It's learned only from experienced clinical masters. You're not going to learn it from rounds in the conference room, from paid actors who are serving as your patients, or from just the protocol that you're being forced to follow in the hospital. You really need to see patients, and you really need to be the physician responsible for them and to learn from others who are more experienced. Part of tacit skills is seeing not only what's there and what not only is in the drop-down menu, but what is not there, and for being able to recognize when the picture does not compute. Some examples in the book, and this tacit skills goes across all types of professions. For example, is the fire lieutenant who orders his crew out of a building where there's a fire on the 6th floor just before the floor collapses. And he said, well, how did you know? Well, he had a sixth sense. Well, he just really knew what to expect, what the pattern was. Maybe the fire was too hot, maybe it was too quiet, maybe it wasn't responding properly to the water that's being poured in it. A very important example in medicine is the NICU, the nurses who love those babies, who just have a sixth sense about when the baby's going bad, when it's going to have sepsis. This is being lost. The perinatologist, that let me have a tour of the awesome NICU at our hospital, after he retired, said it's completely changed. It's all being run remotely from someplace, maybe in Pittsburgh, I don't know, in the hospitals in Tucson. The nurses are very demoralized because they no longer rely on their clinical skills. They're just getting the protocol from above, and the babies are not doing well either. Then my favorite example from the book is from Dr. Huntoon. He was called to the emergency room as the neurology consult because that's the protocol for when you're supposed to give thrombolytic therapy for an ischemic stroke. And he said, no, it's not, we're going to do this. I don't think that's what the patient has. He insisted on a spinal tap. While they were complaining and threatening to call hospital administration, the spinal tap was bloody. The patient had a subarachnoid bleed. He ended up in the operating room having an aneurysm repaired and would have died if they had followed the protocol and given the thromboplastin. And he explains in the book how he knew that just the picture wasn't right. The patient was obtunded but was not paralyzed, and it just didn't fit with the picture of an ischemic stroke. Then a case, of course, of a whiplash injury. This is from a person who has no medical credentials but has very good tacit skills. A man was, after a severe car wreck, was taken to the emergency room. He had an MRI of his neck. The emergency room physician said, "You're okay, go home, here's your physical therapy appointment." Well, instead of getting the physical therapy appointment, he called a friend of his that I also happen to know. This person had experienced, he was probably the only white person in history that Buddhist monks in a monastery in New York City had trained in Qigong, which is not only a deadly martial arts technique, but is a healing method, and I think they have a Qigong master at many Chinese hospitals, according to what he tells me. Well, this man has helped many people improve their athletic skills in tennis and swimming and things, and also has helped people with pain. He came to see his friend, did not touch him, looked at him. Also listened to him. The man said he couldn't lift his left arm, and apparently that had been overlooked by the emergency room physician. Called a chiropractor, who also didn't touch the patient but took this film, which, as you can see, shows a displaced fracture at C5, C6. Poor quality film. Man went back to the emergency room. They again wanted to send him home, but his wife ran in with his film and forced the radiologist or the physician to look at it, after which the man was in an ambulance and on an operating table as soon as they could find a neurosurgeon. Had he followed the initial advice, he would have been paralyzed, or quadriplegic, or else dead. So we need to listen to everybody who has some insight into these things. In the first chapter of the book are definitions of terms. As Voltaire said, if you wish to converse with me, you must define your terms. As a recovering geometry teacher, I knew that we always had to define the terms. And that was the job of the first affirmative speaker in high school and college debate, define the terms. These days, we are maybe changing the terms to a more political form without notification. We've changed the definition of things like case, like vaccine, or like herd immunity to mean something the opposite. Like in Newspeak, they kind of just inverted the terms, the meanings of the terms. But these are some definitions in the book. Evidence is information offered in support of a belief or hypothesis or legally acceptable data. Evidence-based medicine, about which we hear constantly. So it's just so constant that it gets to be very annoying. It's a form of medicine based on legal requirements, statistical medicine. As defined by its supporters, it's a movement that de-emphasizes intuition, unsystematic clinical experience, and pathophysiologic rationale as sufficient grounds for clinical decision-making, and stresses the examination of evidence from clinical research. At our Pima County Medical Society, we had a lecture one time, and we were explicitly told, don't rely on your clinical experience. That means nothing. You've got to look at the data, or at the published data in peer-reviewed journals. Don't believe your eyes, don't believe your ears, don't look at the man behind the curtain. It focuses on research in the new field of clinical epidemiology, encompassing the study of the entire clinical process, including diagnosis and evaluation. There's some problems with evidence-based medicine. A lot of times the relevant evidence simply doesn't exist, maybe because it's a new condition. Sometimes it's impossible to get, or at least unethical to get. There was this famous example in the British Medical Journal about the lack of a controlled study, a randomized controlled study, on the benefits of a parachute when jumping out of an airplane. There's also the problem of the funding monopoly. All funding is under the control of our federal government and on an elite group of peers, which are kind of like the British House of Peers, the Lords, who are not inclined to fund something that is likely to upset their established view of things. If you don't, and if you get funding for an experiment that doesn't turn out, then you're not going to get funding again, so naturally you only ask for grants for things you know are going to work, and for new research you kind of have to bootleg the money and hope you don't get caught. There are conflicts of interest that Dr. Huntoon outlined very brilliantly in an article about the CDC a couple issues of a journal ago. Then we have this replicability crisis. You know, you can't go on just one experiment. You have to see whether it can be repeated. And there was an article in Nature back in 2015 talking about this, quoting even two pharmaceutical companies, Bayer in 2011, who found that more than 75% of published findings could not be replicated. And Amgen in 2012 said of 53 key papers deemed to be landmark studies, only 6 or 11% could be confirmed. David Sackett himself, the late David Sackett, who was really the father of evidence-based medicine, said he was going to stop publishing things about it before he died because he was so concerned about this hijacking that Dr. Ioannidis talked about. And he concluded that it is maybe a valuable tool, yet sometimes the conflicts behind the agendas behind the research are so strong that one worries about whether the hijacking of evidence-based medicine is reversible. Here is an excellent book. I've written a review that will appear in the journal one of these days, called Doctoring Data by Dr. Malcolm Kendrick. And he said if you read medical papers from 50 or 60 years ago, they are crystal clear, and the findings are presented in such a way that you can actually understand what the authors are trying to say. And incomprehensible statistics were kept to a minimum. Today, if you read JAMA or one of these articles, there will be huge numbers of patients, very complicated statistics that it is really rather difficult to figure out. And they do not make the corrections that are obligatory if you're doing things like making multiple comparisons. If you do a study, you're going to maybe test one hypothesis, and you end up comparing 20 different groups who have 20 hypotheses, you are obligated to recognize that just by chance alone, if you do 20 comparisons, 1 out of 20 is going to be statistically significant, just by chance alone. But they do not use the recognized techniques of adjusting for that for multiple comparisons. Plus, and it really is, it's so complicated that the ordinary person does have difficulty figuring them out. Along with the increasing complex statistics, there has been a decline in honesty. You know, without honesty, you really don't have science at all. Instead of real science, we have zombie science. Zombie science is a science that is dead, but is artificially kept moving by the continual infusion of funding. And as Dr. Ioannidis said, for many current scientific fields, claimed research findings may often be simply accurate measures of the prevailing bias. So constantly, if we make any statements about COVID-19 or about early treatment, we're being demanded to produce the data, the evidence, and the only evidence that is acceptable is that which conforms to the already established agenda. Well, what about anecdotes? You know, anecdotes are not supposed to be good. The plural of anecdotes is not evidence. But looking at what's going on today and what all of the experts are saying, I'm beginning to wonder if the anecdote is not the only reliable piece of evidence. It is a first-hand observation from a real doctor who has had contact with a real patient, or from a patient who's telling you his experience out in the world. Of course, we know there are pitfalls in the clinical history, and there's confirmation bias and all of those things. As the infamous Dr. House once said, patients lie. Well, you know, they do. And one of the things that our book does consider is the reasons why patients may not be leveling with you and how to deal with that. But a lot of times patients just don't give you the whole story. They don't recognize what's important. It's up to you as the historian to figure out what the chief complaint is, which is often a very difficult part of the history. But then what I might be called anecdotes these days is the case of Wegener granulomatosis. By the way, I meant to bring you a copy of Medicine. It's sitting on the back table there. I don't have a copy of the 1973 issue of Medicine. I was still in medical school then. That's when Dr. Anthony Fauci published what is probably his last bit of real research and maybe his last experience working with real life patients. It's a little journal. Inside the front cover and back cover, there are a couple of ads for other publications by Williams and Wilkins. No pharmaceutical ads at all. It's all clinical. There's no political correct woke stuff about how we're supposed to bring about equity in medicine today. And I think the articles were so valuable that I actually used a straight edge when I was underlining them many long years ago. Anyway, I don't have anything to show you, but I do have a picture of something that you can't read, but this is the table that was in Dr. Fauci's article. And it has all 12 patients on which he established the standard of care. And there's something, the patient's initials, something about the patient. This is about the kidney findings, the findings of the kidney biopsy, the treatment, and then the follow-up biopsy, the results there, the outcome of the patient, and comments. So you could see for each and every one of these patients pertinent details of the history, and maybe you can see, well, that's similar to a patient that I have. It's not like there's a group of 1,000 patients, all of whom may be very different from the people that you're treating. Well, based on this study, 18 people were treated with cyclophosphamide. The regimen was not a rigid protocol, but was adjusted for response and toxicity. 12 of the patients experienced a remission. There was no randomized control trial. What are you going to tell a patient who's got this horrible disease? We're going to flip a coin and maybe put you in the control group. We've got something that might help you, but just for the sake of science, we're going to let you get no treatment, maybe destroy your kidneys or your lungs and eat away the cartilage in your nose. Yeah, nobody's going to give informed consent to something like that. This is still the standard of care. It probably isn't all that great. Hydroxychloroquine, ironically, is being investigated in what is now called ANCA vasculitis, of which Wegener's is an example, and may actually prove to be more valuable than cyclophosphamide, which is quite toxic. I don't have anything as wonderful as the presentation last night of Dr. Fauci versus Dr. Fauci, but here are some quotations from him. Just because thousands of independent doctors are saying that hydroxychloroquine cures all COVID-19 patient, it is not valid until we have a major study done. But on the other hand, as soon as the COVID-19 vaccine is manufactured, it must be immediately delivered to healthcare professionals worldwide for immediate human injection, and proper studies can be done later. And I guess that is sort of what has happened. That, of course, no doctors are really saying that this hydroxychloroquine cures all patients, but there are almost 300 studies that show that it is of benefit, especially when used early, especially when in combination with other drugs. But those don't count, even though some of them have been randomized controlled studies. This is reminiscent of what happened back in the AIDS epidemic back in the 1980s. Some of you may remember that. Dr. Fauci was the czar then also. The results of his leadership have been, some millions of people have died of AIDS. At the time when he was in charge, some people came to him and said, look, we find there are some studies in other conditions such as transplant recipients who are also susceptible to pneumocystis pneumonia, that if you give them prophylactic sulfa drugs, It protects them against this pneumonia. And Fauci said, I'm not going to tell them that. We don't have any RCTs to show that. And by the way, the NIH refused to fund any such studies. Some volunteer groups did fund the studies. 2 years later, they showed, yes, indeed, it was beneficial. But between Fauci's proclamation and then, 17,000 AIDS patients died of pneumocystis pneumonia. Could they all have been saved? Maybe some of them could have. Is that his fault? You know, he was pushing zidovudine back then as the treatment for AIDS. It is quite toxic. It does have some benefits, but generally only in combination is it currently used. And now he has all kinds of interests in Gilead, the manufacturer of remdesivir, which is the one and only drug at first that was considered the standard of care for COVID-19. A lot of things in the book, I shouldn't call it my book, I should call it our book, with so many of you helped with it. We talk a lot about the interpretation of diagnostic tests, and there are all kinds of tables in there about sensitivity and specificity of various clinical signs and symptoms for various diagnoses. And these are valuable things to know. They're stated awfully precisely, like maybe there's a 93% sensitivity, as if it were a constant of nature, which it is not. It is determined from a patient population, and there's uncertainty in that. But the most important thing, I think, if you are trying to diagnose something, is the predictive value of a positive test, which is extremely dependent on the prevalence of disease. How many of you hear people talking about the predictive value of a positive test? Good. I think it's a pretty sophisticated audience. Maybe I apologize if all of this is very elementary for you, but a lot of people don't seem to be aware of it. If I had a blackboard, I could work out some examples for you, but I think we're constrained by what we have here. That I always have to make myself a 2x2 table for a disease, where the disease present, disease absent, test positive, test negative, true positive, false negatives, and true negatives. And we can see that the predictive value of a test is extremely dependent on the prevalence. Now, most of these tests are really tried first in people who are symptomatic, who are diseased, and who have a high probability of having that diagnosis. But as soon as you start using the tests in a population that's mostly healthy, you're going to find out that the predictive value is much less, and the test is much less valuable than you thought. If the prevalence of disease is only 10%, and if you have a test that's perfectly sensitive, that all of the diseased patients have a positive test, and none of them have a false negative, that's great. If you have a specificity of 90%, that's the true negatives over the sum of the true negatives and false positives, that is considered to be a pretty good test. I mean, 90% sounds great. But if 90% of the 900 patients who do not have the disease have a true negative test of 810, then there are 90 of them who have a false positive. So the predictive value of a positive test is only about half, only 53% in that population. If the prevalence of disease in your population is only 1%, then 90% of the positive tests will be false positives. And what are we doing with the PCR test? We're considering it the gold standard. It's the confirmatory test. And we're testing healthy populations in massive numbers, sometimes twice a week. So it is very likely that most of the positive tests are false positives. People are being stigmatized, quarantined, their contacts, their family are being quarantined based on something that is virtually meaningless. And we've changed the definition of case to mean a person who has a positive test. So all those statistics on how many cases we have, I think, are problematic. There are other problems with the PCR test, that it was developed as a manufacturing method, and Kary Mullis, who got the Nobel Prize for inventing the test, said it should not be used to diagnose anything. Well, we're using it. And Kary Mullis died prematurely and unexpectedly shortly after he had said some very nasty things about Anthony Fauci, which surely was a coincidence. But in interpreting the test, you really need to know a lot of things about it. What primer was used, what cycle threshold was used. On none of the tests that patients have brought to me have I seen the cycle threshold specified. A reporter in Arizona found out that the Department of Health was using a cycle threshold of 37. But every cycle, you are doubling the number of supposed molecules that you have. And remember how these exponents rise up, that 2 to the 25th power is 33 billion, 2 to the 40th power is 1 trillion. And so many of these tests that we've done, we've amplified some fragments of something 1 trillion times and called it a positive test. The WHO says you shouldn't be using a cycle threshold greater than 25. And maybe the CDC is backing off on what it is considering a proper test. But nevertheless, these tests are out there, and you can see why it is just an awesomely effective manufacturing technique. You can take a little bit of something and amplify it 1 trillion times. It's really wonderful. But the PCR test also does have some false negatives. There are case reports of people who were sick. They had 5 negative tests. On the 6th negative test, it was positive, and the next day they were dead. So I don't wait for a positive test to decide to treat somebody that might have COVID, even if they are at low risk. I know Dr. Zelenko, who was a real pioneer on the use of hydroxychloroquine, was treating only high-risk patients. I think that makes sense, except when you find out that there are some low-risk patients who unpredictably crash. And so I personally believe in early treatment, and I think many other doctors share that belief, but you can make a case that most people are going to do just fine without treatment. So what is really going on here in the world? The whole world is being subjected to just incredible pressures, incredible devastating lockdowns and mask wearing and so on. In the airport, you've got to wear a mask, and everywhere there are these circles on the floor telling 6 feet apart, and we've already found out that that really has no scientific basis to say 6 feet if it's an aerosolized virus. So what is really going on? I think, here is the history of pandemics and the history of the world, and the COVID is the first, is that little, it's close to the beginning there. I don't really have a pointer, but it is a very minimally sized epidemic when you compare it with the other things that have confronted humans throughout history. And we survived all of them with natural immunity, maybe some public health measures. We did not have vaccines for any of them except for smallpox, and smallpox disappeared for centuries, several times in world history before it broke out again. It recently has disappeared, and the vaccine has been given credit for that, although and it's supposedly been eradicated. We know that it exists in freezers in Atlanta and in Moscow, and who knows where else in the world. There's been a lot of research done in weaponizing smallpox. Let's see, how do I go backwards? Nope, that doesn't go backwards. So what is really going on? It's been suggested that this might be a biowarfare attack. I think Dr. Merritt went into that. And if it is, what is the weapon? Is this a bioengineered virus? I think there have been a lot of people who have stated such. I think they've looked in 50,000 animals without finding an example of it. One of the things that impressed me most is if you sequence the genome, there is a part of it that codes for arginine in several places. Arginine is an amino acid that is coded for by, I think, 6 different codons. You know, the base pairs, in the triplets and the base pairs, code for at least 1 amino acids. Some amino acids have a number of ways of stating them. Arginine has 6. The one that occurs in this viral sequence is very, very rarely found in nature, but is often used in the laboratory because it is convenient. So it seems to me that that is a fingerprint of human human intervention in this. Well, is the virus the weapon? It so happens that back in 1981, Dean Koontz wrote this book called The Eyes of Darkness that talked about a virus that was named Wuhan 400. Now, although I don't think that Dean Koontz, even though he wrote about paranormal phenomena, had this magical insight, people have been well aware that for decades, bioweapons research has been going on in many places in the world: China, Russia, and the United States of America. Is it the vaccine? I mean, the virus, after all, is not killing all that many people, and most of them are old and close to the end of their life expectancy anyway. Seems to be a rather puny biological weapon. Some people suggested it might be the vaccine. Or some people said, well, this isn't really a vaccine, but it certainly is a genetically engineered product. It certainly does have a very high incidence of adverse effects reported to the VAERS. Now, some people, of course, these are not investigated. They could just be coincidental, but they're just coming from all over the place, including in the database that we have and a result of an AAPS survey that we did. Some of you may have participated. We did the survey because the AMA was claiming that 98% of doctors are fully vaccinated. We said, don't believe it. We surveyed our email list, and our results were that of the physicians who responded, 60% were not vaccinated, which is sort of startling. You know, it's not a random survey of all the physicians in the United States. It's a self-selected group of people. Nevertheless, I don't think the AMA survey was a random survey either. There are all kinds of reasons for not getting vaccinated. We asked both the physicians and the non-physician, even non-medical people on this survey, to give an account of adverse reactions they have seen, and they were pretty impressive. When you see a young person die soon after a vaccine who had no comorbidities, you certainly did not expect him to die, it at least has to look suspicious. I think I may, well. So could it be that this is a weapon, and I think one of the speakers mentioned that it could be genetically targeted? The disease seems to be genetically targeted. It seems to affect people with an ACE2 receptor, and there are certain ethnic groups that have a lot of that and others that are relatively protected. If you want to get people to accept something that will do them harm, then a vaccine might be a pretty good way of grooming them to take it. I didn't bring a picture here of the Gleiwitz sender. That was the radio transmitter in Gleiwitz, Germany, near the Polish border. When the Nazis were getting ready to invade Poland, they would like to make it seem as though the Poles were the aggressors. So they manufactured a false flag attack, where presumably some Poles attacked a German radio transmitter and transmitted a Polish propaganda message. And then the story was that the brave defenders of the radio station fought off these attackers. For this, the Nazis needed some bodies. There was a prison nearby, but it was not a concentration camp. The prisoners were not wasted away. They could have resisted. So the means of killing them was to get them to line up for a shot. They had been getting, every once in a while, what was called a vitamin shot. What it really was a little bit of methamphetamine with maybe a little bit of morphine in it, and made them feel better. It seemed very harmless. So they lined up for their vitamin shot, and then the brave defenders had their corpses. They put them in Polish uniforms. They shot them, but they didn't have any resistance. And this was the story. Now, there are various stories in the literature about what happened here, and this particular one was buried in a very obscure German medical journal. It may be difficult to find again. There are other versions of the story. But this could be a matter of grooming people. If you want them to take something that will harm them, get them used to taking something else. Vaccines, kids have had 70 doses of vaccines. They're widely accepted. They're believed to be safe. And so, well, hey, this is just another shot. Just get it. So that could be a problem. Are the vaccines genetically engineered? There are millions of citations in Google, if you search, on optogenetics, that we are injecting, we are trying to engineer people. We're trying to, in animals and in humans, to affect the way they think, the way they behave, a way of stimulating fear reactions. These experiments are going on. There are, and then magnetogenetics, maybe the new optogenetics, there are only a few thousand references to that. Is this what's going on with the vaccines? I don't know. But certainly the inducing panic, fear, guilt, and adding to the Cloward-Piven strategy that I learned about from Dr. Emmerling, we're overloading the system with all kinds of immigrants, with all kinds of people who are bankrupted and who are newly dependent on the government just to stay alive. So all of these things are severely weakening not just the American population, but populations around the world. And what is the purpose? Some people think depopulation. Have no idea whether that's true or not, but certainly the biggest proponents of this vaccine push, such as Bill Gates, are open advocates that the world has far too many people. And Bill Gates has even said, well, vaccines might be a great way to reduce the world population by, say, 10 to 15%, just because African women would want to have fewer babies if so many of their babies weren't dying of vaccine-preventive diseases. Isn't this wonderful? A life-saving tool that will reduce the population of the earth by 15%. That's billions of people. But there are other people, you know, in the world, maybe not your kind of people. Is it just to profit from selling massive doses of vaccines? The government spent untold billions of dollars building manufacturing plants for these vaccines before we had any idea whether they would be accepted or not. Of course, maybe they did have some idea that they would be accepted, but. Or is the purpose the Great Reset? Maybe you have heard, this is a book by Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum. The Great Reset has been talked about. We've got to get rid of capitalism. We've got to get rid of our current economic system. We've got to get rid of national sovereignty. We can't have agriculture and energy and manufacturing and all these things in different silos. We need to have somebody coordinating all of these things for the benefit of the world's population and of the earth. And climate change has just not provoked enough fear and guilt to get this accomplished. But maybe we can get rid of all the airplanes and the privately owned automobiles and family dwellings and so on by scaring them all with this panic. As Klaus Schwab has said, you will own nothing, but you will be happy. You can't have land, you can't have a house, you'll be eating whatever they say you will, bugs. Bill Gates now has control of 50% of the agricultural land in the United States. So Klaus Schwab is saying, build back better. That's based on the assumption we're going to smash the existing system and build it back better. And just coincidentally, this was a motto in Joe Biden's campaign. I think I missed something back here. Let me see if I can find what it is. Oh, yes, anecdotes, the value of anecdotes. Everything we have is anecdotes. Even if you've treated 1,000 patients and made careful observations on all of them, they're anecdotes. I want to call your attention to what I think is one of the most classic articles in our journal by a British attorney, Clifford Miller, and by an American physician who's an AAPS member, Donald Miller, no relationship. Donald Miller is a heart surgeon, now retired, in Washington. And they were talking about legal evidence, a very famous British case, the brides in the bath case. There was a man whose bride, soon after they were married, drowned in the bathtub. There was no evidence of any foul play of any sort. Just coincidentally, at the time of their betrothal, she had willed her estate to him. Well, it's just a tragic story. After he recovered from his grief, he married a second bride who also drowned in the bathtub with a similar financial arrangements. Oh gosh, what a terrible coincidence. Then a third bride also died in the bathtub. The British court allowed the evidence of the first two events to be admitted into evidence, and the man was convicted of murder and executed. Just enough coincidences is evidence. And what is the other explanation for this? So I think we need to remember that, and that evidence is not equal to a randomized clinical trial. And by the way, there's plenty of evidence that carefully done observational trials that try to correct for the confounding variables can be just as good, if not better, than the RCT. So I don't really know what's going on here, but what do we do about it? Since Dr. Held reminded us that our last annual meeting, which is to be held in the vicinity of the Alamo, was canceled, I thought I'd remind you about that maybe we should remember the Alamo, particularly since there are now forces that say we need to forget the Alamo. And they have an entirely revisionist history of what actually happened there. It is traditionally believed that Colonel Travis drew a line in the sand, and those who prepared to give their lives in freedom's cause come over to me. And the people in the Alamo fought to the death, even though they knew defeat was inevitable. But Sam Houston's dictionary, I thought he crossed out the word compromise. It was not in his dictionary, but I think temporize on this page was crossed out. So the Texans eventually won their independence. And some people are saying that's not a bad thing in our woke society. But there are some few other similar examples in history. The Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC, when the Greeks were fighting against an invasion by the Persians. And about 7,000 Greeks were defending this pass against an invading force of at least 100,000 Persians. Herodotus put the number at 1 million, maybe 100,000 is more plausible. And they fought them off, greatly outnumbered, for 7 days. Eventually they had to retreat because they were betrayed by a local, but they still, a small contingent of forces stayed there and covered the retreat of the other Greeks. These hundreds of men fought to the death. The Greeks lost that battle, but they did not lose the war. The second Persian invasion of Greece was turned back. This is commonly used as an example as to how the few who are adequately determined can fight a huge force. And they're not teaching kids about this in school, I'm sure. They don't want people to know that. Maybe we should learn something about Afghanistan, by the way, that this force of the Taliban, with their rather primitive weapons, defeated the world's only superpower, which is retreated in humiliating defeat. But it's also important for us to remember there are more of us than there are of them. Twitter has not managed to completely censor everything. I've seen some very interesting clips, especially from Australia. I think many of these are made by Ezra Levant, who spoke at one of our annual meetings here. His father, Martin Levant, is a radiologist in Alberta and who's been a source of intelligence about what's going on in Canada. But Ezra Levant has pictured the horrible police brutality that is happening in Australia, where for being outside their houses, or maybe for not wearing a mask, or for maybe no reason at all, these heavily armed thugs are throwing elderly, defenseless, unarmed women to the pavement and pepper spraying them, and apparently getting away with it. But Levant did show a sequence that was very encouraging. There was a large demonstration of Australians who were beginning to stand up for their freedom, and there were these police in riot gear with no identifying badges who were trying to turn back the crowd, and the crowd just ran over them. It just displayed because they were determined and because they were brave, they were able to get the police out of the way. I don't know the end of that story, but people are lying down. They are not defending themselves. if people wake up, if they understand what is really being done to them, what is being done to the keystone of our freedom is medicine. Socialized medicine is said to be the keystone of socialism. But I think that the ability of physicians working with their patients is the keystone of our freedom. And if we lose that, we are in for a very dark totalitarian age. Well, the message on from the 85th anniversary of AAPS, when we met in Dallas in San Antonio by the Alamo, was the Clinton plan, which was going to do away with private medicine, that used the trick of changing definitions. Universal access, which means rationed access to whatever they think you should be allowed to have, plus comprehensive benefits, which means you have to accept all kinds of things. And we see this happening gradually and incrementally, not just with the COVID vaccines, but with transgender treatments and that sort of thing. It was to protect us. It was to keep us safe, save us from medical bankruptcy. And it was to achieve equality of care. I think now we're using the term equity more. And this is being our main concern. Never mind what happens to individual patients, as long as we have some politically defined equity, which, since we can't make everything first rate for everybody, we'll just cut everything down to the common denominator. And I think we all have to decide, what is our line in the sand? People are saying, we've got our jobs at stake, everything is really pretty good for us now, we're never going to have these shortages of food or chaos in the street that some conspiracy theorists are predicting. Everything is just fine, we don't want to fight with anybody, we're just going to go along, and each new imposition on us is just a small thing that we can cope with, that things will return to normal one of these days. We need to find out, what is our line in the sand? Is there some point at which we're going to resist, some line that we're not going to cross? Is it having medical apartheid, denying care to unvaccinated people or to people who are otherwise undesirable? Is it compulsory providing of treatments we believe to be harmful or unethical? Is it book burning, which is already an equivalent happening in our schools and library? The end of a right to work, to worship, assemble, speak, remain silent, buy or sell, or defend yourself? Or will we wait to being treated like the Australians are being treated? I have to be inspired by members of AAPS who are no longer with us. Nino Camardi's truth plus one equals a majority. And Robert Jaggard, one of my favorite ones, I am not going to quit, I am going to fight the bastards. And I think the most important thing to remember, since they're just making us fearful of everything, is be not afraid. That we know that the bad guys, their first weapon is terror, but we know that when the messenger of God comes to see people, he always addresses the people saying, be not afraid, which occurs many times in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And that needs to be something we carry in our hearts always. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Orient. She has agreed to take questions.
Any questions?
Yeah. They're lining up.
Okay.
Am I good? Thank you, Dr. Orient. That was wonderful. Very simple question. I don't know how you'd answer it, but what does resistance look like individually versus collectively? We're here as a group, then we go home and we're islands.
I think none of us are islands. We are all together in this. You can call us for assistance. Dr. Huntoon, if it's a Champeriou problem, Mr. Schlafly, it's a legal question, or just call our office and maybe we can give you some practical advice, at least let you know that they're not alone. I mean, there are thousands of doctors out there who are doing as you are doing, and trying to make you feel isolated and alone is one very powerful tactic. Like anybody who's subjected to sham peer review or something, they all fear, I'm just the only one. Something must be wrong with me.
So, first of all, thanks for doing what you do, and I think you've been instrumental. AAPS has been instrumental in giving guidance, so I look forward to the guidance that you can give us. And I was thinking of simple letters that people could give to their patients to ask their congressman for access to ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine. So things you've done in the past have been really helpful, and I appreciate that. I have one question. I was researching countries in 2015, 16 in Italy. There were a number of domino deaths in nursing homes, and it was related to the Novartis vaccine. And I'm not sure if you know about this or aware of it. Similar things happened, I think it was in Sweden and Norway. And I noticed there seemed to be a correlation of the Novartis shot, which was grown in dog kidney cells, which has corona. Were you aware of any of that, or does that ring a bell to you?
No, those
Okay.
would be important
Anyway,
to know about. But there certainly have been many examples of vaccines in the course of history that have been withdrawn because
Right.
they say we're safe and effective. Well, why are these kids getting narcolepsy, or maybe why are these patients dying?
So I got shut down by Google. After I got down that road, it said my Google no longer worked. Thought it was a mistake. I used my wife's and I shut her down. So I was just curious if anybody else had come across that correlation of the flu shot and domino deaths in nursing homes in Italy, 2 Scandinavian countries, and I don't know where else, but there was definitely a correlation there. And there's some smart people in this room, so we have to pull together. We have to, yes. I'm not making a comment. Anyway, thank you, Jane. Appreciate what you do.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I guess a lot of people are finding themselves canceled on Twitter. And we're trying, I think they're shadow banning me, that they may say every day that I have like 135 followers, but the total keeps going down. So I don't know, but I guess we're going to get wiped out, but we're doing the best we can to stay around.
Yes, yeah. Again, I want to thank you so much for your leadership. One of the things that disturbs me is the quality of our food. I know this sounds way out of our normal bailiwick, but it occurs to me that over 90% of our land is now sterile. Where we plant our crops, the food we eat, it's tasteless, it's awful. And we've now destroyed so much of the fungal, bacterial, normal, natural, that's required for nutrition. And so we've commoditized it so that now the farmers are now, because the price has gone down so much because of the added yield, the push for yield at the price of quality, and how it's killing us. And it's hurting the farmers so much so that now among the farmers in, for instance, Colorado, they've had to now put aside people just to handle suicide calls. And we're seeing this now in medicine, where, in other words, greater yield, higher physicians' extenders, put out more product, you decrease the value, margins get squeezed, doctors despair, and suicide rates are high. It seems like it's a pattern. How do we address this?
I can't really talk about the agricultural things that you started with, but certainly there are waves of suicide, and we see crops being destroyed just because the farmers can't sell them because the government has prevented them from taking them to market. And I think we're going to see a lot of chaos. We're going to see a lot of pain. Our hope is that they've pushed us too far to the tipping point. People will awaken and that they will fight back, and we must at least see to it that a remnant survives, that we need to stand up for each other and for our own communities and see that they're not allowed to win.
Dr. Orient, first, thank you for everything that you do. Just a real quick question. How can we buy your books without giving that sociopath Jeff Bezos a cut of the action?
I think you can get it from the Walters Kluwen's website, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I have one question for Jane. First of all, though, before I say that, thanks for the newsletters. When they come through, I just love them. They're just awesome. They're so well written. Having looked at this with the COVID and all this stuff globally, from your perspective, where is this going in the next year or two?
I guess we're at a crossroads, and it could go either way. I think one of our jobs is to expose what's going on to the best that we can. We realize that there are a lot of people who out of self-defense are in the catacombs, so to speak, but I think there's a lot of resistance out there that we don't know about, and people are trying not to provoke the authorities, trying to stay alive, but they're going to be on our side when the time comes. They're doing everything they can to not cooperate with the regime and to undermine it in any way. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Orient, a true national treasure. Our next presentation, I will introduce at about 1:55 p.m. With the first speaker beginning at 2 p.m. So you've got a little time to rest or do what you'd like to do until then.
Don't jinx it. Don't jinx it. Don't jinx it.